I'm Lieutenant Colonel retired Tony Shaffer, the president of the London Center for Policy Research. Welcome to our latest on Thought to Action, where we're going to be discussing a spectrum of issues relating to China. I'm joined today by Major General retired John Kem, former commandant of the U.S. Army War College, someone who I immensely respect by his intellectual purity and willing to talk about things as they are, not what we want them to be. And a senior fellow, Gordon Chang of the London Center for Policy Research, who's a part of our team who examines these issues at length. Gentlemen, it's an honor and a privilege to have you both here today for this discussion, and let's just roll right into it. We've been faced with a number of issues relating to China, the PRC, where they're going, what they're thinking, and how they're going to execute their national strategy. Over the past few months, we've seen China go through a number of internal political issues, to include the renomination. Gordon, you can correct my language and how I use this, but President Xi has been essentially reelected for a unheard of third term as leader of that nation. So what I'd like to work through today are issues that we need to examine from the collective security of the West, especially as it relates to the United States. And I'll start with talking first off, and I'll let Gordon go by framing, if you will, letting our audience understand better what the recent events of Xi being re-elected and his very public removal of his predecessor from their Congress. So, Gordon, could you try to frame that in about a couple of minutes of what this all really means to what we should be watching for in the recent events in the PRC?
Well, Xi Jinping is president of the Chinese state, but he's also general secretary of the Communist Party, which is a far more important post. And he's chairman of the party's Central Military Commission, which controls the military.
Right.
At the Communist Party's 20th National Congress last month, he got a precedent-breaking third term as general secretary. And also what he did was he frog-marched his predecessor, Hu Jintao, out of the session in front of the international press.
Right.
Clearly, Xi Jinping has solidified his control over the Communist Party. And that means that he is now more able to do what he wants. And he has made it very clear, for instance, that he is going to annex Taiwan during his term at the top of the party. But the other issue in the background is that the party is starting to lose control of the Chinese state. And we see this with the defiance of the people at these zero COVID draconian restrictions. We know the Chinese people are unhappy because of the Chinese economy. And so this is a country in turmoil. And a country in turmoil is going to be especially dangerous to the international system and to the United States.
So let's talk about that a little bit more regarding what that means relating to military strategy and containment. John, in our pre-interview, we talked a little bit about the fact that a lot of people want to establish a containment strategy that may emulate or echo what we did during the Cold War. And I think we all agree that's not practical. It's an apples and oranges comparison. And so taking from what Gordon just said, how do you see our approach should be relating to the fact that it's not just about military, it's about economic, it's about the perception of what leadership can and cannot do or will not do within the Chinese government, and what we should do in response to that. So, John, do you want to address that a little bit for us?
Yeah, I'll make a couple of comments. I think one of the hard parts related to this is we look back, I'm going to say with fond eyes, we look back to the containment policy in the 50s and 60s of the Soviet Union, and we sometimes act like if we could just have that again, if we just had the one good policy, then that would be good. But even that wasn't a one policy. How it was done around the world was very different. What we did in the Mediterranean and what we did in the South Pacific and other places around the world was not exactly the same. So part one is we didn't have a single way of doing things. I think the second challenge for us is maybe it's because of the political dynamics, which you're either with me or against me in the United States, it seems like, right? And so there's no nuance. So the idea that we could do a policy that brings together diplomacy and economic power and military power and information challenge, which is very different than it was in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and do that in a coherent way isn't impossible, but it's not simple, right? And so you have to, and the second part is it has to transcend, 2 to 4 to 6 year cycles of senators and presidents and congresspersons. So,
Right.
But we did that in the 50s, 60s, 70s, right? Not everybody was the same on how they felt we should approach, I'll call it, Soviet Union. But they were still saying we need to stand together in NATO and other places together, even if we're slightly different in the approach. And one of the hard things now is people want to just do the opposite of the other person. And the United States can't have that. The 2030 and 2040 are coming quickly. And the China challenge isn't going away, just as Gordon just talked about. It's going to get worse in the near term, for sure.
So let's talk about that for a second, because one of the things I would have hoped we would have learned from COVID is that we have immense and very integrated relationships with China relating to commerce and trade. And John, clearly, we did not during the Cold War have this immense relationship of interlocked economies with the Soviet Union. As a matter of fact, we were able to use a number of levers of government to devastate their economy. And had we been tied to that economy, we would have been devastated as well. So we were able to, I think, identify the fact that, oh, yeah, we can do economic things or do things to actually undermine their ability to generate wealth, to undermine their ability to generate their military, which I think we used very effectively. But that's not the case here. So during COVID, there was an opportunity, in my judgment, to decouple ourselves from China. We chose not to do that because things are kind of roaring back to that relationship. And I would argue to our peril, because not only, as Gordon said, and I do believe that the Chinese government and the current leadership want to reacquire direct dominance of Taiwan. I would cite as evidence of that the Chinese government, PRC, breaking the agreement with the British over Hong Kong. They basically have done what they said they wouldn't do, to basically take full dominion over Hong Kong well in advance of the ending of the treaty. I would say that's a bad sign going forward. So with that said, how do we examine the region realistically, Gordon, what's going on? And let me cite for you a couple of things. The Japanese government is now wanting to change its constitution so that it can basically legally expand out its military to be more aggressive in defending the Japanese interests, as well as other nations such as India and the Philippines and Vietnam, all indicating that they're very concerned about the economic competition that's coming with China. And some of this is very practical by the fact that there's limited resources, for example, of protein, fishing. So how do you see, Gordon, how should we be approaching as the United States this clearly more bellicose, more aggressive China from the perspective of how do we work with our allies within the region?
What we've been seeing, and this started in the Obama administration, but certainly picked up during President Trump's time, and we even see it now in the Biden era, is that the United States is working with friends and partners more closely, and we are starting to develop a containment strategy. Now, it's a lot slower than the development of containment of the Soviet Union, but it's occurring nonetheless. And also, there are two other things that are of note. One of them is that companies have now realized that their long global supply chains are no longer viable. We're seeing them pulling out of China or pulling out of the region and moving back to other places which are considered safer. So, for instance, Apple has worked with TSMC, the Taiwan semiconductor giant, to make 3-nanometer chips in Arizona instead of in Taiwan. And we are seeing companies move to Mexico and to the region because they feel that it's just not viable to be in Asia anymore. But what is really driving a lot of this, Tony, is Chinese behavior. China, by being aggressive, is forcing countries to start to think about defending themselves, but also China is self-containing. It is isolating itself. This occurs throughout Chinese history when Chinese rulers felt that the outside pressures were too much, and Xi Jinping is doing that. So you're seeing a convergence of these trends where I think that our relationship with China is going to be at a much lower level in the not too distant future, as both Xi Jinping pushes us away and as, for various reasons, we pull ourselves away.
So to that point, John, so years ago, our friend and former commandant of the War College, Tony Cuccolo, challenged me and the team that we work to come up with a Plan Orange for the 21st century. And for those of in our audience who don't necessarily understand what that is, the interwar period between World War I, World War II, the Army War College and Navy War College essentially came up with the Rainbow Plans, essentially examining threats, not from the potentiality, but like, hey, what if this happened? What if this happened? And one of those plans, which came out of the Rainbow Plans, was Plan Orange, where a lot of documentation and academic studies have been done to do that. And then basically the Navy, U.S. Navy, God bless them, actually took what they had learned from Plan Orange and used that as a plan to go defeat the Japanese during World War II. It was, I think, as I mentioned, my estimation is about 80% accurate. So one of the things that's not been done, which I think we need to examine, is, John, how do we go about trying to do a Plan Orange for the 21st century where we examine threats? And it's not just how do we put together military forces to go take on a near peer or a peer. What more should we be thinking about regarding a Plan Orange for the 21st century?
Well, it's actually a very difficult challenge when you think about it, because we look back and we see those rainbow plans and we go, we need some of those. And you correctly pointed out that there was a mix, there was a whole bunch of different ones. And the orange one was related to Japan. And I'll mention a couple other ones here in a second, but those were years in the making. And the real value was less about the actual plan, but is that you were thinking about what challenges there are, how do you respond, how do you mobilize resources? So an example for that would be, they were thinking about if one of the scenarios, a different plan was, what if England and Japan mutually came together to fight the United States? And no one really thought that was going to happen, but the idea was, boy, that's really hard. So where would we have to respond? How would we mobilize resources to get things away from the coast potentially, or rebuild coastlines or build new shipyards? All those things we're thinking about. So it wasn't just a military approach. It was a whole of government thing. And the value was in thinking about it. So the same thing we do war planning now. I think the difference is we tend to do them for a short period of a week or two. We do them very narrow and focused. Right. And that's very different than in a much more global world and how you would do it. Because what we don't want to do is think through, I'll give you an example. I'll use Taiwan as an example. The solution is not the Rainbow Plan of 1940, which was, flow ships and go straight to the problem, right? You can't do that in a satellite interconnected world with ballistic missiles and hypersonic missiles and 1,000-mile standoff in some cases for ships. It's a different approach, but by bringing together the military, the economic, and the whole of government and the information side, and doing a series of games, I'll call them games and plans, but it's not just it's not an anti-China thing, right? You're doing it. What if China and the Russians are doing something together? What if China does something with the Philippines in a different way? What does that do to our ability to station and base? They're going to do things in Central and South America as well. It's not a single place, right? People forget, the Russians, the Soviet Union had interests around the world. So how do we think about these things? And in some cases, the value was people in 1920s did that as a junior staffer in the Treasury Department and a junior staffer there wasn't the Pentagon then, right? And then 20 years later, they were now Eisenhower and MacArthur. So they had been thinking about those kind of problems over time. And so when the time came, you could respond in a better way.
All right. So I'm going to put you on the spot. John, why can't we think like that anymore? Because I spent 30 and a half years. We've talked about some of the things that needed to be addressed. And as you know, I advised Joe Dunford, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, at one point as part of a team. My team always tried to go back to, how do we just take all politics, set politics aside, and just think through things? Why have we lost the ability to kind of stare at things with steely eyes and see them for what they are and work through that as a challenge?
I'm not sure I got the answer to that part. I think part of it ties into we're really busy. Everybody's really busy. Yeah. The interconnectedness of communications, the fact that you can travel quickly. I mean, no one would fly to Atlanta for the day and come back that night like a business person might today. Some people overnight. And so the ability to go, hey, next month we're going to spend 3 or 4 days sitting in rooms and talking was considered part of the job. Now we tend to be, I need to be moving and going somewhere new and touching new things. And the idea of 4 days in the same place is kind of anti-American almost in terms of business approach, if that makes sense.
It does. And as a matter of fact, I proposed to the International Spy Museum, Chris Costa, and before Don Rumsfeld, before our friend Don passed, to do essentially a relitigation of the Korea conflict. Because I think I would argue in many ways, rethinking some of the past mistakes, and I would argue not ending the Korean War in the 50s has led to kind of some open-ended issues we have not dealt with. Just saying, don't want to cast aspersions on past leadership, but we had proposed that we bring in people like Don to kind of talk about what we have done differently, and I still want to do that someday with the current cast of senior leaders we have now. With that's kind of a story for another day. But Gordon, going back to what John just said, what do we have to do to actually kind of peel off the political concerns and just speak frankly about what we need to do to examine the real issues of a more bellicose China?
We need to stop lying to ourselves. We had the President of the United States on Monday in his post-summit press conference say that we didn't necessarily have to have a new Cold War. Well, we are in what is, I think, worse than a Cold War. We have China killed 1,076,000 Americans by deliberately spreading COVID-19 across its borders. That's the toll, 1,076,000, the toll this morning, according to the Johns Hopkins Coronavirus Resource Center. We can argue about the number, but any number above zero is unacceptable. We also have China killing Americans with fentanyl.
I've talked about that as a weapon of mass destruction, absolutely.
A chemical weapon. The Communist Party has near total surveillance state, you could argue. They know what the fentanyl gangs are doing because those gangs are large, well-organized, international in scope. They launder their proceeds through the Chinese state banking system. So we shouldn't consider them as criminal gangs, as we term it. This is the Communist Party deliberately killing Americans. That's right. 77,000, 78,000 Americans died of overdoses from illegal Chinese fentanyl last year. So this is the Chinese sense of war, unrestricted warfare, the title of that 1999 book by the then two Chinese Air Force colonels. So we've got to recognize that this is not competition in the Westphalian international system, as President Biden likes to put it. This is all-out warfare short of what we consider to be war, which is kinetic. Yes, there's not kinetic warfare at this point, but below that, we're taking enormous casualties. So the first thing is we have to have those honest conversations about China. And I think that this is going to be driven by China itself. China is going to do things that are going to make us confront that reality. We don't have the political leadership at the top, but we do have the American people, and we have a growing consensus in Congress about China. So this is something that we've got to talk about every day, which is the reason why what you're doing, Tony, is so important, because you're not letting the political leadership, you're not letting the people in the Pentagon away from confronting this reality.
Well, anybody who has worked with me in government knows I tend not to pull punches, which has gotten me in a lot of trouble, just saying. But that's okay. I'm not going to change. So with that said, Gordon, you said something very important I want to circle back to in a second, is deterrence and leadership. But let me reframe some of that, what you just said. And John, to you on that point, I met with Mark Milley when he was Chief of Staff of the Army, when you were still Commandant, by the way. And Mark told me flat out, he told me to my face that he had read the doctrine, the internal Chinese doctrine, had it translated from the Chinese, and he read it. And he told me that he had confronted his counterparts in the Chinese military and said, I've read your doctrine, and it says that you intend to use military force to reacquire dominance of the Pacific. And the general said, yes, we plan to do that. And Mark said, well, you're going to have a problem with us if that's true. So I'm just telling you what Mark told me. So it's not like I'm making this up or not. So what do we need to do then? If that is the position of now the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, what must we do to create a real deterrence, because to Gordon's point, the American people, I think a lot of the military folks I know and have dealt with and advised, we all recognize this. What must we do to establish a credible deterrence to dissuade China from being bellicose or taking military action, if that's even possible?
Yeah, I think the last part is the hard part, and Gordon can probably answer better than I can on is it even possible? Do they even recognize those signs, right? Because deterrence is you're trying to say we're going to do some things that will then get inside the other person's head to deter them from a war level to a business approach to there's lots of things you deter on.
Right.
And so the real question is, and let's face it, we have an inability sometimes to put ourselves in the people we're talking to's shoes.
Absolutely.
A great example I would give is Americans, we don't really understand raw power, right? In our society, we might dislike a political party. My neighbor I like or don't like. We worry sometimes about our government being a little too involved in certain aspects, but we don't understand and Gordon mentioned it earlier, the true dominance of a state like China and how they control people. And so it's hard for us to project ourselves and think like they do. I think the deterrence side, the U.S. military, it's not just about military deterrence.
Right.
Because the
exactly.
economic deterrence is far more powerful as it impacts China over time, as they've trying to be more internal with their spending and how much they need to export. So there's lots of deterrence that can happen in the economic sphere and the military sphere together. And we don't really talk about that very much. We tend to think them because in our country, we separate the two, right? But you can't separate the two when it comes to China. So that's part of it. I think the second part is sometimes we're overly critical of ourselves and we nitpick. I'll give an example. It's a busy world. During the Soviet era, we had things going on in the Pacific, things going on in the Atlantic, things going on in Africa. And we didn't say, we should only be in one place. So you can have a China-centric policy and still be doing things in other places. You have to, because China's operating in those other places. And so we have a global military challenge and a global economic challenge and a global messaging challenge. But we tend to fall back and fight amongst ourselves and go, it's a Democrat thing or a Republican thing or an independent thing. No, it's a United States thing, right?
Right.
And it's us and our friends and allies.
Well, to that point, John, and back to you, Gordon, on this too, why have we not made it clear to China that part of our deterrence in our strategy should be to make sure that the Chinese leadership, understand there would be a cost to them personally, as well as to them as a nation, regarding expanding and being more bellicose. For example, we all recognize the Straits of Malacca to be a choke point that they have to be concerned about relating to energy and energy coming through. I would argue, tell me if I'm wrong, threatening directly or indirectly their ability to gain access and maintain oil coming through to China could be a devastating effect to say, hey, just to remind them, it's like, dude, you've got a lot of vulnerabilities here. Maybe we should examine that. Another area which I don't think we've adequately examined or frankly threatened them with is the fact that last time I checked, the Chinese government spends as much money per year on maintaining and expanding potable sources of water for its ever-growing population as it does on military spending, which to me, that's a huge vulnerability. So why have we, and I used to be a planner in this, that's why I know some of this stuff. Gordon, why are we not actually saying, dude, you've got some huge vulnerabilities. Maybe you ought to think twice about threatening the rest of the world. Why are we not doing that?
There are a lot of reasons for that, Tony. One of them, though, is that for decades, the United States thought it was in the interest of not only our country, but the world, for the Communist Party to strengthen itself. And it's taken a long time to wean ourselves off of that. But we also have this notion that we can integrate China into the international system.
That's been the strategy, absolutely. And
so it takes a long time to get out of bad strategy, but that's really where we are right now. And because of that, this economic integration that we fostered, China now is influential in the United States. So that's really something that that it takes some time to undo.
Right.
But right now, I think that when you talk to people around the country, including in Washington and New York, you get the sense that we need to have a new strategy because the old one has produced disastrous results. We just don't have the consensus on exactly what to do. But I believe that China will push us there because of its increasingly belligerent activities. China believes, and the senior leadership of the Communist Party, and certainly Xi Jinping believes, that not only should they rule the world, but that they will rule the world. That the United States is in terminal decline and is not in a position to stop them. There isn't that we can't deter them, as we've just discussed. So there is a real sort of arrogance right now, and it's going to take some time for the United States to disabuse them of that. Part of the problem is that Biden, for various reasons, is stuck in the old way of doing things and won't take those measures, for the most part, to stop China and to contain it, which I believe we absolutely need to do.
Well, I'm going to ask a question about that regarding economics and currency as our last question to both of you. But let me go to John real quick on the issue. So, John, am I wrong? Should we actually maybe trying to make it a little bit clearer that you as the Chinese nation have huge vulnerabilities, which if we chose to really mess with you, we could do some damage. Do you think we should be making that more clear in our messaging to them at this point, or would that be unhelpful, do you think?
That's a really difficult question because it depends on the forum you're doing it in, right? If you do that in a very public way, my impression is that doesn't really work very well because then you're making them have to bow up a little bit. And so the question is, what are we saying behind closed doors to really help them understand their vulnerabilities? Or we're doing some things in an indirect way to demonstrate those vulnerabilities without having to talk about it. A great example would be, I'm not trying to say we should do this, but a few years ago, the Chinese blew up one of their own satellites up in space, right? Why did they do that? They didn't want it. They did that to show capability and go, you don't mess with us, right? So what are some things that might need to be done? I'm not advocating that at all, but there are other things you might do that would say, not so fast. You have vulnerabilities too. That doesn't mean you have to talk about it all the time. It doesn't mean you have to do huge, grandiose things. But how do you get, and Gordon can explain it better than I can, there's only a small group that really needs to understand this. We don't need to, we're not trying to confront the Chinese people, billion people. We're trying to say to a certain number of them, not so fast. And maybe Gordon can answer the rest of that better than I can.
Well, this goes to my next question to Gordon, because I think it has to do with how do we then globally confront them? Because one of the things I believe China's trying to do with Putin and the Russians is find a way to remove the U.S. dollar as the currency of choice for all transactions regarding energy. And that's why I wanted to relate this question about kind of threatening China's access to petroleum by the fact that the Russians both have a lot of access in their own fuel. They're now contemplating building more direct connectivity between the Russian oil fields and China. And secondly, I think there's ultimately a desire by the Chinese especially to remove the dollar as the currency of choice by the world. And I would argue, I'm not an economist, I'm an intelligence officer who tries to understand how things are linked. My understanding, Gordon, if they're successful in trying to remove the currency, and for the audience to understand, Richard Nixon essentially pushed us off the gold standard onto this petrodollar. Kissinger advised him, and I'm not here to judge or debate the wisdom of that choice, but at that point in time, the United States, the U.S. dollar became the currency that's used for all major transactions regarding energy. That is the standard. And I think the Chinese want to challenge that strategically. So, Gordon, how do we go about obviously meeting the challenge? Because ultimately, I would argue removing the United States and the dollar as the fiat currency of choice, that would devastate our economy. And obviously, there has to be a replacement. I don't think the yuan is ready for that. But obviously, something else may be on the horizon. So how do we examine this perspective of, I think they want to bump us off from having our currency be the choice currency and thereby reducing our ability to have economic influence?
Well, the first thing that we'd have to do, because you talked about energy, Tony, is to stop irritating the Saudi Arabia. President Biden thinks that you can poke them and there be no consequences.
That's why I asked this question. Absolutely. Because why stick with the United States if they're going to poke you for sticking with us? Absolutely.
And the Biden administration has had, like the Obama administration, has very pro-Iran policies. Well, Iran is, Saudi Arabia believes Iran is its mortal enemy.
Right.
So we've done a number of things to make sure that the leaders of Saudi Arabia just move closer to China. So we stop doing those things. I think we go a long way. And while we're on that topic, we have to convince the Gulf Cooperation Council countries that we are serious about Iranian terrorism, because they don't think that we are. So there is a lot that we can do in that area. The one thing about the Chinese renminbi, it is not convertible on the capital account, and it's
Right.
not nearly as convertible on the current account as they say it is. So it's never really going to mount a serious challenge to the dollar. But there are a number of things that we can do, and one of them is to stop depreciating our currency by this massive spending in Washington, because there's only one country that can end the dollar's reign, and that's the United States. So we need to stop doing that. And there's one other thing, and that is China launders a lot of its fentanyl money, a lot of the proceeds of its criminal activities through New York. We know about this, and we should be applying Section 311 of the Patriot Act to declare these Chinese banking institutions to be a, quote, of primary money laundering concern. We disconnect a Chinese bank, we really go a long way to telling Beijing, you've got to stop this. President Trump in June of 2017 disconnected a small Chinese bank, Bank of Dandong, under Section 311. But we know that the big four Chinese banks have continued money laundering for the North Koreans and others. We just got to stop that. And this is also just goes beyond what we think about China. This is, we've got money laundering laws. We need to start enforcing them.
I agree. But beyond that, John, as you know, when Russia was held to account, all the sanctions went forward. It seems like China gave them a back door. And this goes back to the currency issue. So, and the ruble has actually been strengthened by the sanctions, strangely enough, because now Russia is saying you need to pay us some rubles to buy our energy. So what do you see about how we need to approach this currency issue regarding China and Russia and what they could do to try to damage our continuation from the economic perspective?
Well, I think Gordon covered it pretty well, because he said you have to be consistent and you have to apply it in lots of ways. You can't just talk about, the Russia example is a great one. I'm not sure I know the latest today, but I read something recently that almost all the oil that Russians were producing before, they're producing now. It's flowing to China, India, other places, but effectively it's less than 300,000 barrels a day or something is not on the market. And so those are nice to do in the beginning, but they're not very effective over time. They've now found a way to all get it to the market. So the real question is, how do you do things that truly deter or make things really hard for the long term? And then you have to change them, right? Because human beings are good at workarounds. So whatever we do, you have to keep applying different pressure. And what you did in, today won't be the same in 2024 and 2026. You have to be able to adapt, because they're going to adapt. They're smart, right? That's why they're trying to find these different approaches.
So one last question, same question to both of you, and we'll close it out. So what lessons, I'll start with Gordon. Gordon, what lessons have the Chinese leadership, and we all recognize it's the leadership, not the people of China. What lessons have the Chinese leadership learned by the way we've dealt with Ukraine and Russia in the current conflict, and how will they take those lessons and apply them to what they want to do to accomplish regarding Taiwan?
Beijing saw the Biden administration was not capable. They saw this with the catastrophic withdrawal from Afghanistan, which led to, I believe, Putin believing that he could invade Ukraine. Couple things. The Chinese have, and the American narrative is that the heroic resistance of the Ukrainian people have convinced Xi Jinping that the Taiwan people are going to stop him from invading, and so we don't have to worry too much. Well, there might be a little bit of that, but I think that he was emboldened. Xi Jinping has been emboldened by the failure to deter Putin. Remember, the United States, the 27 nations of the European Union, and Great Britain in 2021 had an economy that was 25.1 times larger than Russia's, and yet we failed to stop him. The Chinese have seen the failure of Biden policy, And they, I think, that's emboldened them. The other thing is, and we'll talk about the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia. They may have been a little bit surprised that President Biden was able to rally the international community, but they've noticed that those sanctions over time haven't worked because they haven't been enforced and they're not tough enough. So I think the Chinese believe that they don't have to worry about sanctions imposed on them should they invade Taiwan or some other place. And that's why Ukraine is really, I think, so critical. We stop Vladimir Putin, we put him in the box, we get him out of Ukraine territory entirely, then we go a long way to reestablish deterrence.
So, John, same question to you. What do you think the Chinese will learn militarily regarding their potential approach to taking Taiwan back should they want to use military action? Based on
I think in terms of what Gordon said, in terms of incentives and disincentives, he covered that pretty well on what their lessons may be. And some of that won't play out until we get to whatever this end state is going to be. And we don't quite know. And you drop it down into the operational tactical level. What does that mean to the Chinese military as they buy weapons, plan, train, and equip? I think it remains to be seen because we're doing that same thing on our end. Obviously, we see long-range artillery and long-range sensors and drones and things like that are becoming much more ubiquitous. But then again, it's also against two somewhat stagnant forces. The Ukrainians and the Russians don't move very fast. And so it's hard to take too many lessons and go, it means it's the end of the tank or the end of infantry or the end of this or the end of that. That's, I think, the wrong lessons at this point. Other than you can be touched from a long way away. And we always knew that, but now we've seen it. But for us, for our Army and Navy and Air Force, the Marine Corps, or for the Chinese, what does it mean to our, I'll call them the ground forces, the day-to-day naval and ground forces? I don't think we know yet because the Russians weren't that good and they weren't moving very quickly. And so what does it mean to somebody who is more organized logistically? There is more ready to go do things, right? Like the United States would be, or like I assume the Chinese would be.
Well, John, you and I both came up during the era of the Fulda Gap and training to defeat a very determined combined arms military coming from the Soviet Union. And I'm looking back at what we were trained to expect and looking at what transpired in Ukraine. It's like, really? Did you guys not understand combined arms? I mean, it's kind of like how you won against the Germans during World War II. So it's like, how did you forget that? With that said, with all kidding aside, it's been an interesting set of things. And I agree. I think that while we've seen some of our weapon systems, anti-tank systems used to great effect, I don't think we should draw from that. It's time to get rid of armor and proceed to look at how we can have a completely unarmored military going forward. So, but well, that's a discussion for another day.
If you don't mind, if I could just make one comment related to that.
Yeah, please.
On the Russian side, I mean, I think the performance is pretty poor because they don't practice that large scale maneuver. If you don't practice it, you are not good at it, right? And if you think about the size of Ukraine, what they did was essentially like attack into Ukraine from Louisiana, Oklahoma, and New Mexico on 3 different fronts that you can't support, you can't pass material back and forth through and think you're going to do well, right? Well, we could probably pull that off because we have a great Air Force and supply trucks, and we would find a way to make it all around. But that's really hard, and we're about the only Army and Department of Defense in the world that could do that logistically. And so they chose something that would have been hard in World War II when they were practiced, right? When you think about those distances.
Yeah, that's true. Well, and that's one of the things I've always appreciated. Even as a lieutenant, I recognize the value of a reforger, actually testing our ability to move great numbers of men, material, and weapon systems rapidly. And I think that's something clearly I'd like to believe, Gordon, will deter the Chinese from thinking about too much if we can actually do some stuff in the Pacific if we need to. So, gentlemen, it's been a great privilege to have you both on. Gordon, Chang, obviously check him out, monitor everything he does through a number of outlets. We are proud to have him as a senior fellow. And General Kem, I always appreciate your insight and wisdom to help instruct what we're thinking to give our audience and the world a better understanding of what we should be looking at. So thank you both today for being with me.
Thank you, Tony.
Thanks very much. Appreciate it. It's great to be part of it.
Yes, sir. Okay, and thank you for joining us for Thought to Action. We'll be doing more of these thoughtful, in-depth reviews with an eye on the facts and what we need to be thinking about regarding trying to instruct and help you all and understand what the real national security issues are to these very complex global situations. So again, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Tony Shaffer, the President of the London Center and Project Sentinel, and we look forward to talking to you again very soon. Thank you very much.